Those of us with ADHD or autism get burnt out so regularly by our jobs that we consider becoming self-employed just so that we can work in a way that works for us. But that doesn't have to be our only option. Hello, my name is Lee and I'm a neurodivergent leadership coach specialising in growing the careers of mid to senior neurospices. And today I'm talking about how we can make our workplaces more neurodivergent friendly so that we don't have to choose between struggling through cycles of burnout or opting out and going into the completely different kind of stress that is entrepreneurship. Last week I put a video out about why we keep getting burnt out and the features of our modern workplaces that mean we keep getting stuck in these cycles of stress and burnout. If you haven't seen it already, I'd really recommend going back and watching it because it can be super validating and help with our self-acceptance to know the reasons why some of this happens. In this video, we use two 2022 papers out of Sweden called Stress and Work-Related Mental Illness Among Working Adults with ADHD, a Qualitative Study, and It's Like It's Designed to Keep Me Stressed, Working Sustainably with ADHD or Autism, to gain an understanding of the factors that cause stress in the workplace. And we're actually going to continue using these papers today because they have some really interesting insights for us. One thing I love about both of these papers is they're based on interviews with people who are actually autistic and ADHD, and so they take into account our real lived experience when it comes to their recommendations and their suggestions. So with that in mind, let's dive straight in. One of the challenges we spoke about last week was organisations with insufficient structure, routine, and that are just really disorganised. This is super important to both ADHD and autism because routines are really helpful for us. Even if ADHD fights it at every turn, it's really useful for us to be in those structured environments. It's also something that just helps all employees. Everyone gets frustrated by chaos and disorganisation. So for an all-round benefit to all employees, but especially employees with ADHD or autism, it really just makes sense to implement better organisation and better structure in our working lives. One of the most important working relationships is that between the employee and their manager. And actually in these studies, people responded saying that this relationship was so important and crucial to the success of autistic and ADHD employees. The saying that people leave bad managers and not jobs may or may not be true, but it is super important to the working relationship when you are neurospicy in these particular flavours. In particular, a manager's overall openness to supporting their neurodivergent employees is super important. A manager that is completely unsupportive, doesn't want to know about it, doesn't want to help at all, is really detrimental to well-being, because not only do we have all of these struggles that we had with already, the ones that we're asking for help with, we also now have the challenge of trying to make that relationship work when they are unsupportive and maybe even judgmental about our neurodivergence. In contrast, bosses that are supportive can have a significant positive impact. And they found that actually, even if bosses couldn't do anything, the fact that they acknowledged and understood what the difficulties was made a huge positive difference than if they just ignored it and said, I'm powerless to do anything about it and I don't care. This leads on to whether or not to be open about your neurodivergence at work. And they found that for people who were and who got support from HR, their colleagues, and all of those kinds of people, it was actually a really great thing to be open about it. They found more self-acceptance, they found more acceptance from others, and that really helped their self-worth and their well-being. By disclosing as well, they were also more likely to come across other neurodivergent employees and could therefore build a community of people in the same workplace who have some of the same struggles and can come together from that respect. However, if this disclosure doesn't go well, then the opposite can happen. In fact, the paper, It's Like It's Designed to Keep Me Stressed, actually goes on to say the following. Negative attitudes and a lack of supportive relationships in the work environment was the greatest obstacle to employment for adults with ASD. Let's just reflect on that a second. The biggest barrier to ASD employment is the negative attitudes and the lack of support there. Nothing to do with their individual ASD at all. This can also be particularly hard for those of us who are high masking, which is something I relate to myself. It can mean that they can't see the ADHD or the autism in us and therefore they think it doesn't exist. Or maybe they set expectations too high or too low because they don't understand what we are challenged by or why we find these things particularly challenging. Or maybe they just outright dismiss it and say something like, you can't have, insert your diagnosis here, because you find X really easy, without taking into account the fact that that means we find Y really hard. Often people ask me if they should tell their work about their diagnosis, and I find this a really difficult question to answer actually, Because if the workplace is supportive and are willing to accommodate, then it can be a really, really positive change and really helpful. But if the workplace isn't supportive, then it's really negative and they'd be better off by not disclosing at all. It really comes down to whether you personally would be safe if you disclose. And that's much easier for someone who has the privilege to change jobs or, quit without a backup or pursue a legal case if needs be, than it would be for someone who is in a much less stable or privileged position. Regardless of whether or not you disclose, learning more about your own neurodivergence is always beneficial. The paper It's Like It's Designed to Keep Me Stressed refers to gaining an insight in their own function help them master their work to a greater extent, and that an increased understanding of their own functioning had helped them become less critical of themselves. This alludes to the concept of working with your brain, which is something I talk about a lot and spoke about in my previous video around burnout. In this study, some participants did express frustration about how their new insights didn't always translate into actual strategies or actionable items for making things better. And actually this is something we cover in coaching, is how we can use our knowledge and build strategies that take us forward. Oscarson and colleagues, the first paper, actually go on to talk about our own perception of our neurodivergence, and specifically ADHD in this case, as that paper was focused just on ADHD. It talks about how our perceptions of our ADHD were overwhelmingly negative, and in fact the respondents couldn't find anything positive to say about their ADHD. But they did acknowledge that they had unique advantages themselves, such as problem solving, quick-wittedness, creativity. Interestingly enough, there have been studies that already link the creativity and problem solving to ADHD, and I find it really frustrating how negative we can be towards our ADHD, even though it does have these benefits. I talk about ADHD strengths a lot for this reason, and actually it's something I work with my clients in finding their unique strengths, but also their ADHD strengths, so they know them and they can use them. If you need a bit of a pick-me-up about your ADHD, you can go back and watch one of my videos from right back at the start where I talk about strengths of ADHD. One important part in the discussion about workplace support though is that the onus usually falls on the employee themselves to advocate for it or work out what it is or chase up what they need. It's not something that companies often do proactively, and it falls on the neurodivergent employee to do all of this on top of the day job that they're already finding difficult. In fact, I would imagine that most of you watching this video are neurospices looking for suggestions you can bring to your workplace, rather than employers proactively trying to find out what they can do. I'd love to be wrong, so please, if I am wrong, let me know in the comments, but that's kind of what my assumption is right now. It is important to recognise that everyone's neurodivergence presents differently, so workplaces can't just assume that because something has worked with one autistic employee that they can imply the same thing across the board to all of their autistic employees. So therefore, yes, they do need to work with their employees to find out what works for them, but there's a difference between working with them and making them do the work to chase it on top of their day job. This is important because it goes beyond just workplaces and also extends into healthcare. Usually a multidisciplinary approach is recommended for treating ADHD, so that's medication plus other things, but the other things are very rarely available. And actually for those of us who struggle with medication for various reasons, like I do, it can be really hard for us to actually get any support whatsoever. We have to fight and fight for it, and that's really hard to do on top of everything else that we have to do. Another issue is that support needs to be flexible and meet us where we're at a particular time. The study talks about cases where someone's neurodivergence goes through a period where things are a little bit better, but because they appear to be getting better, all support is then withdrawn from them and they're left with nothing for when things get worse again. ADHD, autism and other forms of neurodivergence are lifelong. They don't just go away, we don't grow out of them. And so we need support that varies and works with us for what we need at any particular point and match our ebb and flow, where sometimes things are going to be a lot better and sometimes things are going to be a bit more difficult. One thing that I don't hear enough about when talking about ADHD symptoms, and is even lacking from these two papers, even though the primary participants were predominantly women, is the fact that our monthly cycles have an effect on our ADHD symptoms, and our hormones correlate with our symptoms becoming better and worse as the month goes on. There are weeks in our monthly cycle where emotional dysregulation and executive function challenges are turned up to 11, and we find it really hard to cope, whereas the rest of our cycle, we can be absolutely okay and doing great. I think there is pressure for us women to be cool and capable month round, especially if we're in male-dominated workplaces, because we don't want to seem to have our periods affecting us at all. It's a natural part of our human biology, but I completely understand why. Even though women's rights have come a long way, there are still men who would dismiss women as being overly emotional or weaponise our monthly cycles against us. But frankly, some weeks I work worse due to my cycle. Some weeks my mindset is all over the place, some weeks I really struggle to focus and get things done, whereas other weeks I'm bossing it and are so productive that I surprise even myself with how productive I am. I'm still learning how to work with my cycle, and I'm still somewhat resistant to the idea of it, even though I'm trying to change, due to the taboo and the discussions around it, and frustration with my own lack of productivity in those weeks. But it's an ongoing part of my acceptance of who I am and how my neurodivergence works, and so it's not something that I can just dismiss and ignore. So what is clear is that support needs to be flexible, it needs to respond to the whole person, and it needs to match with where they need and meet them where they are at a particular time. The second paper recommends occupational therapy and other forms of intervention that might help with this. And that's part of why I do what I do with the coaching, because it is completely flexible, it is one-on-one, and it is working with what the person needs to be. Instead of trying to get them to follow, oh, you should do this, and you should do this, and you should do this, I work with the person to see what works for them. And I think that works far better for those of us who are ADHD or autistic. If that's something that is interesting to you, I always put a link to my website in the description, so just write me a message on there and we can have a chat about it. And that's where I leave things for today. This topic is not complete, and I'm hoping that as we get more and more neurodivergent people into the workplace and into positions of leadership and our understanding of neurodivergence evolves, then we're going to find that there are workplace interventions and changes that we make that make the world a whole lot better for all of us. And I'm really excited to see what the future brings here. If you enjoyed this video, please leave me a like, comment and hit subscribe. And you might be interested in one of my previous videos on how ADHD affects my personality. Thank you very much for your attention today.